Thank you, folks. Can we have the reflecting team out here as well? Because there may be some comments addressed to the reflecting team. Okay. I understand that we have some time for questions. One of the things that I wanted to do was to terminate the meeting at that point because we see possibilities of the reperformance of the old story, and I think it's important for us to get together with that letter and so on.
Yeah, that's exactly what was happening right at the end. You're right.
Okay, I wonder if we could have some questions about the session. And we have about half an hour, I think, maybe a bit less. And also, would you please feel free to address the questions to all of the members of this group. And I'm sure, David, you might be happy to have some questions too. So
yes.
Would you make it clear who you're addressing the questions to? I'm sorry, I shouldn't have assumed that, David, but yeah.
Hey, I'm addressing this question primarily to David. I was wondering, in terms of working with Mike, if any work had been done in giving him some socialization skills which might make it easier for him to fit into the family, and also if the same thing was done for the sister. I just saw him as having many mannerisms that would be, and also as being very suggestible, as he mentioned when he said, "My friends told me to set the fire." And I was wondering if anything had been done just to cope with parenting skills or everyday living skills so that the family could come back together and really function as a unit.
Not with the family, not with Mike and the family per se. That hasn't been done. Mike's had socialization skills in some special setting or another since he was 5 in special ed and in the group homes. And he's pretty comfortable with that style, I think. And his family seems pretty comfortable with that.
I'd like to make a comment about that as well. I don't think we need to think about the idea of importing skills. I think that's a very problematic idea. Most of these skills training programs have to do with an upper middle class value system, and they're really a specification for how people should be in their relationships. And I know that to some extent Mike's mannerisms run him can be isolating for him in certain circumstances. But I'm also quite clear that it would be possible for Mike to perhaps get more in touch with his own unique skills or his own special knowledge, or if you like, indigenous knowledge, and find other ways in which that could be performed. And I'm quite sure he'd experience more competence, and others would experience him as more competent. That would be the thing that I'd be most interested in. Yeah.
This is for Michael. I noticed that the parents sat like a monolith in the middle, the kids on the outside.
Yeah.
I thought of Virginia Satir's The Parents Are the Architects of the Family. I wondered why, and the mother did show some very negative kinds of behavior in her interactions, and I was wondering why you dealt with the kids' relationships with each other and didn't touch the parents who have 2 very disturbed kids.
I didn't see 2 very disturbed kids in this interview, for a start. The thing that Mike presented as the problem was his relationship with his sister. And it sounds to me that Mike's been defined as the problem in a great number of ways. And I think he's fallen under I think there's been probably a lot of people that have been the authority in the relation to Mike's life. I was interested in how we could take up Mike's idea about the problem, how we could relate to him as an authority on the problem. That seemed to be an important starting point for me. And I was thinking about, well, maybe how could that also take in some of the other issues that were raised as the session progressed. Your comments about Virginia Satir, I don't know what Virginia Satir would have done here, and I haven't really had a great deal of exposure to her work. I don't also necessarily have the idea that the parents are the architects of the family. I think that family members are situated and situate each other in stories about their lives and relationships. And these stories determine the meaning that members of families give to their experience of each other. It's also these stories that determine the aspects of experience that are selected out to be expressed in the family. And thus, these stories have their real effects in shaping the family. and constituting the family. So I would say the story is the architect of the family, not the parents. Is that interesting? It's very hard for me to see you, and I can't really gauge whether or not the responses I'm making are responses that you're interested in, or whether someone else should respond or whatever. It's a bit hard for me to get any feedback from you. But
my question is for you also, Michael. I was curious as to when at the beginning of the session you made such a point of the score being 3-1 for fire, and then you left fire for the very, very last moment.
well, I think that we're faced with so many choices when we sit down with a family. And the problem is not where to start. The problem is, how do you make a choice about where do you start? What is the point of entry? And I made a decision early in the piece because I had a sense that this young man's authority in relation to his own life had been very much overlooked. So, and we could have started a number of other places as well. There may have been some other factors involved in me actually seizing upon this point of entry, and I guess I could also speculate about them. But my sense when I sat down was that this was a young man who hadn't experienced a great deal of validation in his life. Found it very, very difficult, as I said, to experience himself as an authority in relation to himself. Across the session, it became quite clear that he was entering into the position of being his own advisor and so on. And so that was the reason for entering into that. I wonder if anybody else here would like to comment on that question.
I think going back to the fire would have been, for the family, a chance to retell an old story. They had a lot of past experience of the fire, and that would have dominated the session, and it wouldn't have left space for new stories to emerge around the other important discoveries that the family made about themselves.
What are your thoughts about that, Dave?
I was really curious as to why he did that, but as I listened to Irene's explanation, that makes a lot of sense to do it that way. That it would have they would have gotten back into the old stories, and there is this emerging new story that I've noticed also.
Yeah, I guess that's a better answer, much better than my answer. That it might have been getting back into the old story. And do you know that old stories aren't good for you? They're really not. And I have not found one old story being helpful in my life. And do you know that despair is not good for you either? Have you tasted despair? Yeah, it's not very helpful. And so it's not a good idea to... We're very responsible. Obviously, most of you are familiar with the idea that we don't have direct knowledge of the world, that we can't have an objective description of reality. So we're very much involved as co-authors in these meetings with families, or co-constructors of the world. And I believe that we should be very clear about the responsibility that we have in terms of the realities that we are involved in bringing forth with the families that we work with. And I do think that we could have very easily got into, I could have asked some questions that could have easily brought forth this other dominant reality and been very unhelpful for this family.
One of the things that struck me most about this interview was Mike's level of anxiety. And I was wondering how you, Michael in particular, or anybody else who might have been in your position, decided, first of all, how that affected you personally as a clinician, and secondly, how you decided to incorporate that into your treatment, whether that changed what you usually do, if there is a usual.
Oh, this interview, I mean, I was so anxious about doing this anyway that I cannot separate out my anxiety in relation to the family from my general anxiety. And so it's a very hard question for me to answer. And certainly this context would affect how I work. And exactly how, it's very hard for me to say. But obviously, you know, when you're doing an interview in these situations, it's a very unusual environment for such an interview. And it's far more complex than meeting with people in my own room at Dulwich Centre. So it certainly has a profound influence on on my experience of the interview. In relation to the family, I saw as a group of persons who were in a lot of pain, and I had a sense that they'd all felt very disqualified by various systems. And I guess so something I can separate out from the pain is the sense that I had of their disqualifications as persons. And so I had some experience of that, and I could detail that in more specifically, but I think I'll just leave it there. I had a general sense of pain from this family. I had a strong sense that they'd been disqualified in very many ways. But I also found these examples of their protest exhilarating. And in a way that countered the anxiety that I felt about doing the session and countered some of the pain that I experienced in relation to them. And, you know, there's always a history of struggle and protest. There always is. You know, these dominant stories that people have about their lives and relationships are only partial. There's no way that any story can represent the richness of lived experience. So I do know that these family members have an experience of each other somewhere that doesn't fit with this dominant story. And we can see that they're taking steps to, in a way, restore their lives and relationships at the moment. We see some areas in which they're starting to protest. And so I know there's always a history of struggle and protest, and I'm always interested in tuning into that. Okay. I know that there are always many experiences that contradict the dominant story of the problem.
My question is for Carl. I was impressed by the feedback that you gave to the mother and the father about their ability to look beyond Michael's fire setting and the image that other people had of him. And I noticed that was one of the comments that the mother picked up from the reflecting team. And my question is, if you were the interviewer in the session, how you would have expanded on that theme, or maybe a better question is if you would have expanded at that point.
Well, if I'd have thought of it at the time, I probably would have responded to it. I don't know whether I would have or not, but I think I would take a slightly different position with response to an earlier question about focusing on the fire setting or not focusing on it. To me, it would be a legitimate thing to respond to, but my concern would be how you responded to it. I mean, one could respond to the fire setting story, which is such a dominant story in their experience, but to respond to it in a way to separate it from them as persons, to invite them to see how they're being oppressed by that story, and that story is keeping them frozen in the past. So to me, it would be legitimate to have a conversation about that and to focus in that direction. It's not necessary, but it depends on how you do it. Like what Michael did today, I liked very much, was to shift the focus and to acknowledge and validate Mike's concern about another issue and to bring that forth and open space for them to, escape some bickering. But another thing that I'd like to, potentially could be done in the future, is to align the protest against the old story. I mean, if they as a family could do that, I think that would be very liberating for them, to set themselves against the fire-setting story as dominating their lives, so they could build a new future for themselves. So, but in response to your specific question, if during the interview had thought of what I thought of afterwards, which took I had to reflect upon it, because I wanted to do something to validate the parents so that they experienced something that they were doing or contributing that was potentially healing and constructive. Because I think they could have interpreted Michael not asking them any questions as a negative judgment upon them. And I wanted to at least bring forth the possibility that we could see that they had some resources as parents that could be healing in relation to their children.
I think that the reflecting team was clearly experienced by them in quite a powerful way. And I have a strong sense that it was very confirming for them. And I don't know whether you got that sense, but I certainly got that sense in the room. So I think we should congratulate the reflecting team.
I have a question for Michael, and I guess for tying David into this too. Since protest is a theme that's being used to help these people feel more in power of their future and to get rid of the old story, I wonder if you also couldn't follow up with the religious fundamentalism and reframe that to be a protest against evil, and then follow that through their family of origin, so that you could say they've always been a family that in some sense has been in protest of something, and then they could harness their protest power to make a better future.
It's an idea that could be entertained, but I'm interested in them attributing their protest to themselves. And I'm interested in what sort of sense of personal agency that might flow on for themselves as persons, so that it's not good against bad or the devil against God. And I think that there's many other questions. Obviously, well, I think it's obvious that we could have asked a great number of other questions. We had a certain time period, but I think it was possible perhaps to ask a great number of other questions that could have brought forth a sense of personal agency for these family members. So I'd be concerned about the idea, and if in fact in any way it interrupted that process. David, that question's for you as well.
You got the wrong David.
Oh, right. Which David was it for?
The social worker.
I think they've got their work cut out for them as far as protesting against the old story when they start to take on the county, because that's quite a powerful system, and they'll need everything they can to go up against them. And I think Vicky has the seeds of the protest well in hand, as she mentioned that Mike doesn't belong in the hospital, which means the only reason he's in there is for dangerousness, and she's seeing something. She's struggling with seeing him as not dangerous, with the old story of seeing him as dangerous. So that's what she's really trying to overcome, and putting her to practical work and convincing the county of the same thing, I think will be where the action is. I'd like to respond to an earlier question around anxiety also. Mike indicated that he was not anxious, and my experience of him is that he was not anxious. I think that those are his mannerisms that are something he's just real comfortable with.
I just thought of a quote in relation to that, a quote that I made in the Institute, and it is in relation to what you were saying, David, about this old story that is part of this family's experience. So we know that that's part of their lived experience, and we could not expect that in any way to be erased from their experience. We do know, however, right here there is a new story. At least we see some seeds for a new story, and today we saw some germination of that. Now, all that really matters is that the new story outripple the old story, and it reminds me of a quote from Bateson. You're probably all familiar with it. Some of you may agree with it. It goes like this. I'm misquoting Bateson, but it's something like this. The ripple that lasts the longest lasts longer than the ripple that lasts not so long. Okay, now I know some of you may agree with that. Would you like to hear that again? It's very profound. Okay? The ripple that lasts the longest lasts longer than the ripple that lasts not so long. Isn't that profound? Okay. All right. These are the sorts of wonderful things that we can learn when we read people like Bateson. And what's really interesting here is how, in fact, in an ongoing sense, could we contribute to this new story outrippling the old story? That's really, that would be the focus of any further work that I did with this family. And I don't know whether that's a good focus for you or not, but
Yeah.
my guess is it is.
Yes,
Yeah.
good guess.
I talked with David before the session briefly and got to know him a bit. And my understanding is that the work that David was, well, you were involved in the session, but for much of the time you're an audience to this work. Yes. But my understanding from what David told me is that this work has a fit with his own ideas, his own preferred practices and values in his work with people. Was that?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so, yeah.
I have a question for Michael. In watching you today, I found that you were rather directive and suggestive in the work that you were doing. Particularly with this young man, you at times would block him from saying things and interrupt him. I wondered if this directive approach and suggestive approach is an important part of this therapeutic style and this therapeutic approach.
Every interview is different. I couldn't say this is a blueprint for anything that anybody else should do. In terms of interrupting, I mean, I would say, rather than saying interrupting, I would say that I was attending. You know, that Mike would say some things that I became very interested in, and a lot of the interrupting was me attending. And I think that, once again, we're responsible for what we select out. In some of my interviews that people have seen on videotape or in other live situations, they've said that I ignore things. There are certain things that I ignore, and I've even been accused of being single-minded. Would you believe that? It's true, I have. And my argument is that is not that I would ignore things. I would select out different things. I mean, when you say that you see something happening in a session that you, you know, if someone says, look, you ignored this, I'd say, no, you selected that out. And so I guess to a large extent, I go where my attention takes me. And I think that's part of the process. In terms of the suggestive side of things, what I'd argue is that there were certain pieces of information that I had that constitute unique outcomes. And they were facts that were presented. You know, that, for example, Debbie talking about being organised, for example. You know, that's a unique outcome. Mike being in touch with the fact that, well, his father, what did his father say again? Wonderful. He's doing things at his own suggestions. These are unique outcomes. Now, if we have one of these unique outcomes, they're like a sparkling fact. These facts, I call these unique outcomes, and I borrow the term from Goffman, Irving Goffman. And a unique outcome is an event or an experience that could not have been predicted from the reading of the dominant story. These are unique outcomes. Now, when we identify these, we encourage people to relate to them. So I often ask lots of questions, and I didn't get to ask lots of questions I didn't get to ask here, but some of these questions I call landscape of consciousness questions, and some I call landscape of action questions. And I borrow that from the work of Jerome Brunner. You know that every story has a landscape of action, events fitted together in a particular way, and they have a landscape of consciousness. The landscape of consciousness is to do with what the characters in the plot think or feel, or what sort of perspective they have on the events or on the plot or whatever. Now, landscape of action questions are those questions that invite family members to plot the unique outcome into a sequence of events across time. Okay? They bring forth the landscape of action for the new story. So I might say, well, look, how did you get organised? And Debbie's response was, Debbie, that's correct. Debbie's response was, well, I forget what she said, but I said in relation to that, so you've become so you become forward-thinking. So now I can understand that more. So we see here a new story being co-authored about Debbie as a person. Okay, we have this unique outcome. She's getting organised. How did you do this? Well, I've become forward-thinking. Okay. I could have asked a lot more questions about how she got ready to take this step, and you know, where she got the idea from, how she did it, what she did that was effective in her remembering to remember to be organised, and so on. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. And so they're the landscape of action questions. The landscape of consciousness questions, well, what does this say about you as a person? Or, Dan, what does this tell you about Debbie that's refreshing for you to know? Okay. Well, what do you think it tells Mike about you that he might have been blind to before now? Okay, that he might have been oblivious to? Or how do you feel about this? I mean, is this a good feeling? Well, if she says yes, it is, to be aware of actually you becoming, the fact that you're more forward-thinking and so on. If this is pleasing, well, what effect will that have on? You know, the fact that you're pleased about this, how will that affect your next step? I call these landscape of consciousness questions. They're to do with what a person thinks, feels, and so on. And it also has to do with the new realizations that persons have about each other and their relationships. So we didn't get to see a lot of these questions because, you know, the therapy was evolving. And if we were to meet again with this family, we'd see a lot more of these landscape of action questions and landscape of consciousness questions. So if we build up a new landscape of action and a new landscape of consciousness, we have a new story. Okay.
We have 4 people left with questions. I don't know if you can make it in 3 minutes, but we'll give it a try.
No, yes, no, yes.
That's to Michael. I saw the family today, was really impressed with how they transformed during the hour.
Sorry, how the what? I can't quite hear you.
How they transformed, there was a sense of the family that changed right in the meeting.
New possibilities and so on.
And I was wondering, as sitting there, you know, how in your practice you're supporting this. How long do you meet with families, or what kinds of things you do when reality reminds them of the old self or the old story? What do you do to...
Well, I can't answer that question very extensively in
Sure.
2 minutes, but there's lots that can be done, and this presentation is only very partial. You've just seen a first interview, and we've talked about some aspects of this interview, but some of you may know of the work of Barbara Meyerhoff.
Who?
David Epstein introduced me to the work of Barbara Meyerhoff. Barbara Meyerhoff is was an anthropologist. Unfortunately, she died a couple of years ago. Barbara Meyerhoff was an anthropologist that studied an aging Jewish community in Venice, Los Angeles. Venice is a very poor suburb right alongside Santa Monica. Okay. Now, this was a community of aging Jewish people who were losing a sense that they even existed. Most of their children were away in New York or somewhere else, and they were very neglected, very isolated, and had a sense that they were losing any sense of actually being real. So they got together and they painted this fantastic mural that is like a restoring their lives or revisioning their histories, and it's like a combined history from this group. Then they started to recruit an audience to this mural. Then they started doing other things that Meyerhoff called definitional ceremonies. They started to identify and recruit an audience to the performance of the new story. Now, this is very validating, and you can see the validating effect of this in the team. So just being interested in what Barbara Meyerhoff had to say about definitional ceremonies can be very helpful in our work in terms of how we might assist people to open up space for the performance of or circulation of alternative stories. And so there's lots to be done there. In a way, this is, in a sense, a counter-practice in therapy. Instead of thinking about people on an individual stage, we're thinking about how can we open that out? How can we identify and recruit an audience to the performance of these new stories? We know if we're successful with that, if we can establish conditions under which persons can identify and recruit an audience, we do know that will contribute very significantly to the ongoing rippling of the new story. And with that, I'd really like to stop, because I really need to go and have a pee, and I don't know whether I could manage another question in my current state. So...